Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Christensen, and this is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, celebrating classic horror throughout history with new episodes every Friday night. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the 1940s Universal mummy films. Leaving behind the melancholy tone of the 1932 Boris Karloff original, these films introduced a new mummy, Kharis, a shambling and bandaged silent avenger played first by Tom Tyler in 1940's The Mummy's Hand, celebrating its 85th anniversary, and by Lon Chaney Jr. in 3 subsequent sequels. Often overlooked when compared to Frankenstein and Dracula, the Mummy series has its own atmospheric and weird B-movie charms, with each film picking up, at least loosely, from where the last one left off, transporting the action from Egypt to small-town New England to the swamps of Louisiana, all while ignoring the passage of time in any realistic fashion. With brief running times and minimal budgets, these creature features found a formula that works. Moldy murders by moonlight, duplicitous high priests, and lots of Tana leaves. Whether it's The Mummy's Hand, Tomb, Ghost, or Curse, it's time to pay our long overdue respect to this unfairly maligned franchise, one that made The Mummy a true monster icon in the Universal canon.
He's alive! Let me go! Let me go!
Do you mind if I say I think you're a swell person?
You're very beautiful. So beautiful, I'm going to make you immortal.
Hey, where's the girl?
Well, you'll never see her again.
I'll give you 3 to tell me where she is. I'm not kidding.
If you were to kill me, you're leaving at large a monster that only I can control.
It's time to unwrap those time-traveling shamblers. We're going to be talking about the 1940s mummy movies from Universal, and we've got a great panel to chat about them with me. Let's bring everybody in, and let's say hello to Frank Merle.
Hello, happy to be here.
Michael Weber.
Hey, it's good to be back.
And the disembodied voice of Barry Kaufman.
Greetings from ancient Egypt and the land beyond.
And we're going to be chatting about the 4 mummy movies from 1940s, The Mummy's Hand from 1940, The Mummy's Tomb from 1942, The Mummy's Ghost from 1944, and also The Mummy's Curse from 1944. And just in case anybody was worried, we're going to be spoiling these 80-year-old movies, so please be advised. Thanks for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. Michael, you and I were talking backstage. These movies, they really don't get the best reputation. Yeah. But I have to say, I was so entertained this most recent viewing, and it sounds like you had a similar experience. Where did you come to these movies for the first time? I expect the 1932 Boris Karloff was your introduction.
Yeah.
Did you come to these right away?
I think I came to one of these, and I can't remember which because they do all blur together, but I think I came to one of these first. And then saw the Karloff. And frankly, I was a little disappointed in the Karloff because these have so much more action. But then, of course, grew to love the Karloff version. But I was a little confused because of the Imhotep and Kharis and because I didn't really realize, I think at first, that these are not actual sequels to that film.
That's right. That's a whole other mythology that gets whipped up, and you and I talked about the original 32 mummy not too long ago. And so I'm really glad to have you back to kind of chat about this second wave of them. Frank, I'm curious to hear, like, what is it about these movies that attracted you?
The Mummy's Hand in particular, and this whole series, but The Mummy's Hand in particular holds a very special place in my heart, because the first horror movie I ever saw was Night of the Living Dead, which I'm wearing this shirt. I think I was 10, and it was like a late night showing, and I snuck downstairs when I was supposed to be asleep, and I watched this movie. And then I was so scared I couldn't sleep that night, stayed up all night. And then in the morning, I confessed to my dad that I had done a bad thing, right? I had stayed up and watched a naughty movie that I wasn't supposed to watch. And he said, yeah, when I was your age, I watched a movie called The Mummy's Hand. And I couldn't sleep that night. And so tonight, when I get home from work, we're going to watch The Mummy's Hand.
I love that.
And it's sort of like like for a 10-year-old with horror movies, it's like they're getting caught smoking a cigarette and they make you smoke a whole pack. So my dad, because I had seen Night of the Living Dead and it had scared me so much, he wanted to show me the movie that scared him so much as a kid. And it was scary to me, but it was specific, and we'll get back to this, but the eyes, right? The hollowed out eyes that they did in The Mummy's Hand was the thing that, so many years later, my dad still remembered as a core memory for him and his introduction to horror films. And the fact that, when I shared with him, oh my God, I saw a horror film and I'm so freaked out, and it reminded him of The Mummy's Hand. Then after seeing, because that was one, so The Mummy's Hand is one of the very first, I guess it's the second horror movie I ever saw.
That's cool.
And then I saw all the sequels, and it was actually years later when I saw the Boris Karloff one. For whatever reason, I just, I watched the 40s ones, and I watched Abbott and Costello. I think I was in college by the time wasn't there there's a really good one from 10 years earlier, isn't there?
Cool. Barry, what was your introduction to these mummy movies?
Funny, it's a little bit like Frank's. When I was 5 years old, I had a babysitter's husband who loved watching Saturday afternoon horror films, and he watched, the giant Gila monster and all these kind of movies. These were great. So he said, Creature Features is on Saturday nights at 7. You should watch that. And so the first movie that was on was the original Mummy. I had been to the Field Museum just a couple months previous, and I'd seen the mummies, and I thought that was kind of spooky and weird and eerie. And, my parents were telling me what they were. The scene in which the beginning, when Karloff is wrapped and he wakes up, of course, I didn't expect the mummy to wake up. When he woke up, I ran out of the room screaming, absolutely screaming. My mom said, Barry, I know you love this stuff, but you really can't watch these movies for a while. You just can't do it. So, of course, the next week I snuck up to their bedroom on their small 13-inch or 15-inch black and white, and I watched Creature Features. And the opening scene of Creature Features has Lon Chaney and the Mummy's curse coming through Tanta Berthi's door in slow motion. And I ran out of the room screaming again. My mom said, Barry, what are you doing? And I said, sorry, I can't, whatever. And I said it was mummy movies, and we tried other movies and I could watch them. And eventually I got to watch all the movies. But Lon Chaney's face, just that makeup, always scares me no matter what. Now, the films, rewatching them, as we'll talk about, some of them don't quite scare me as much, but his appearance definitely always has shocked me. And the Mummy has always been probably the character that, just in theory, scares me the most.
Well, it's funny because Frank talks about Night of the Living Dead. I mean, this is really a story of the living dead, a revived corpse, or one that has never really gone away. In terms of context in the universal cycle, we had the big wave in the 30s of Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy in 1932. And then things had started to die off. And then come 1939, we get The Son of Frankenstein. And that kind of kicks things off again. We get The Wolfman in 1941. And that gives us our new horror star of Lon Chaney. But The Mummy's Hand was really kind of riding on the success of The Son of Frankenstein. We revived our Frankenstein franchise. Let's see if we can get the mummies going again. I don't know why they decided to not go with the Imhotep storyline. They come up with a new character of Kharis, it's very similar in terms of, it is someone who tries to revive the dead princess. In fact, they use stock footage of Karloff getting wrapped up.
As you say, it's a very different but similar premise. And I think the thing that strikes me as I kept reflecting on trying to divorce myself from then the years later Brendan Fraser approach, which is very much based in this movie, this specific movie with this particular group of people. But it strikes me that this one is almost a little bit more inspired by the serials of the day. The sort of adventurer kind of guy and the comic sidekick and, you know, the sexy girlfriend who isn't, are they friends or are they going to get together kind of element. And then taking and throwing specifically Tom Tyler, who has no relation in any way to Universal monster movies, but is a Western star of the time. So again, sort of an adventure guy that I don't know, were they thinking that they were going to try to move him into the canon of, you know, Universal horror monster characters like they sort of were playing with, you know, some of the people in the Wolfman? But that's what strikes me about it, is that it's really inspired more by the serials of the day, which were such a big deal at this time, than it was about going back to that sort of Tutankhamun lore that was so prevalent in the Mummy movie of the early 30s. I think that vogue had kind of died down a little bit too by the early 40s.
Well, it's interesting because they had so much success with the Son of Frankenstein and the Invisible Man Returns, which came out like the year before, did very well too. So they were really on the horror bandwagon. And, you know, they were certainly looking for something for Lon Chaney to follow in the footsteps of his father as the great horror star. And, you know, he was doing some of the Inner Sanctum things with some of the same directors who made these Mummy movies, actually. And they were looking for something, you know, a little more ambitious in the horror realm. And they picked the last thing that Lon Chaney wanted to do, of course, Lon Chaney Jr. wanted to do. But I think really for Universal, it was simply, you know, it seems to be what I could see historically, a box office decision. It was a decision, the horror genre was popular. They were making movies that, like Invisible Man Returns was a relatively low budget film, and they had a very good return, no pun intended, on the film. So they, I think they just thought, oh, wow, well, the Mummy, you know, character and Lon Chaney, and they fit together. He did the Wolfman. He was doing Dracula, or about to, you know, whatever that was coming up as a project for him too. So I think they were trying to fit him in his dad's mold. And certainly I think it's kind of funny that they picked a character where, unlike Chaney's other characters, there's actually very little possibility for any expression or acting at all. It's sort of like binding him in bandages and heavy makeup and masks and things, so he couldn't do anything. So it's kind of ironic. But I'm pretty sure that was their theory. And I agree, again, that, you know, they were going with Ben Pivar, the director who directed a lot of action and espionage and adventure stuff, like, you know, Indiana Jones Today kind of stuff, serial stuff. And the film really has more of an upscale version of Abbott and Costello meet the Mummy in a way. It's like the better version of that in a way, with all the comedy. But I think they were going for a light entertainment with the Mummy, you know, sort of starring Lon Chaney.
As Michael was commenting, you know, like we started off with Tom Tyler. I'm not sure what the story was.
Not with Lon Chaney. I'm sorry, with Tom Tyler. Sorry about that.
That's okay. It makes sense that they would plug in Lon Chaney because, they were trying to make him a new horror star. But it may have just been a decision in that regard, like why they went with Tom Tyler versus anybody else.
He's a recognizable name, and he's cheaper than Lon Chaney. Lon Chaney was still getting a lot of money from Universal even for these Mummy films. He got quite a bit of money, you know, mummy money. So I think it was probably a question of budget and who was probably availability.
I think in a way it's worth considering that, like Brendan Fraser, they were really maybe trying to push Dick Foran. Because he was a very popular star at this time. He did a lot of Universal Westerns. He was doing movies with Abbott and Costello. He was sort of this young Brendan Fraser kind of guy, this football lug. He made his splash in The Petrified Forest years before with Bogart. So he was kind of like a serious actor, but then who became more of an action star. And being that the weight of the film is really on his character and the love interest and the comical stuff, and the fact that they also followed up with his character in the next film.
Right.
It feels to me like they were really kind of more focusing on, let's create an adventure star, and the Mummy is not going to be super. We're not trying to make Tom Tyler into the new Karloff. We're trying to make a new action fun star. This film also, maybe more than anything in the Universal canon, seems to want to feel modern. feel like 1940. Even the Wolfman, you know, with Maria Ospanskaya and all of that, still feels like it's in that European 30s weird. What era are we in? You know, there are horse carriages and gypsies and all of this stuff, but yet then they're in cars. This feels strictly like a modern 40s film.
I think you make a really great point about having Dick Foran as kind of our lead, because then Wallace Ford is kind of his sidekick. You know, we talked about Abbott and Costello a couple of times already. And, you know, there is that lovable byplay between those two. You know, it's clear who's the comic foil and who's the straight man, but it really is about those two. That's that relationship that we're following.
In a wide shot, they look like Abbott and Costello walking through the Cairo market. Like we've seen that shot in other movies. I just want to talk about the tone of this film versus the vast majority of the Universal monster movies, right? This one in particular, of the four we're talking about today, The Mummy's Hand is the funny one, right? And is funny, has a lot more whimsical than, you know, its plot than I think really any of the other monster movies that I can think of. You know, Michael comparing this to Serials is great, and an adventure story, and the comparisons to the Brendan Fraser Mummy movie, right? Which they weren't trying to make a horror movie, they were making an adventure movie. When this movie has to be scary, it's scary, and when it's not, when the mummy isn't around, which is for a lot of the movie, it's quite charming, and they're having a lot of fun. And it does feel, it feels like it wanted to be an Abbott and Costello movie. I mean, you know, with this bizarre plot about, you know, we're going to fleece the magician to get his money, and the magician's daughter is like, well, not, you know, like there's just a lot of weird, fun, quirky stuff that happens before it gets scary. And maybe that's what makes the scary stuff scarier.
And I think it's well informed by people who might have seen the 1932 Mummy. And what was missing from that movie is that there's not much mummy in it. And here we actually get the mummy, and for the subsequent films, we actually make the mummy a true universal monster in a way that he wasn't really the first time around. I mean, all the publicity shots we see are Karloff in his kind of like drawn human form. Yeah. We get the one shot of him in the casket because that's really the only time we see a mummy in the 1932 Mummy. Here we get a full-on mummy, and we never see him in a human form.
It's an interesting thing to consider that if they reflected on the original film, and we talked about this when we talked about that original Mummy, like what was the process of him when he shambles out? Then he's unwrapping himself and finds clothes and finds shoes and that fit him. Like they
assimilates back into society. Yeah.
Right. And they eschewed all of that and learns how to speak English on top of it. You know, all of that's gone. And now he's just in mummy form. And they
never has any dialogue. Right. Yeah. I mean, we should mention that. So instead of Imhotep, we now have Kharis, who is our new mummy. And we have Princess Ananka, and those two characters carry through all four films. Mm-hmm. And then there's good old Amun-Ra, whose anger can in fact shatter the world. Mm-hmm. I like that gets invoked every single movie. But George Zucco plays our kind of high priest, Andoheb. And George Zucco is just a wonderful character actor. If you're a fan of those kind of low budget 1940s horror films, you will see him pop up time and time again. Dead Man Walk, Mad Monster, Cat and the Canary. Mm-hmm. He shows up in House of Frankenstein, The Flying Serpent, and he played Moriarty in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. We have a very clear setup as to like, this is the one who will bring down wrath upon the infidels that dare to defile this tomb. Yeah. And that carries through all of this. That is the overriding, it's like rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. You've transgressed, and therefore we're going to stick a mummy on you. But we have Steve Banning and his pal Babe. Steve is definitely an Egyptologist. I'm not sure what Babe is doing there other than just kind of like riding Steve's coattails. The chemistry between all of the characters is really fun. There's a lot of really enjoyable ensemble performances.
The thing that you're pointing out about somebody like George Zucco that even within this series, when you get later, John Carradine and Turhan Bey, but before them, Karloff and Lugosi, these guys were all Shakespearean actors.
Mm-hmm.
These guys, I mean, and then Basil Rathbone and throw these people. These were legit the best actors of their day from stage and screen, and they would do these movies, but come to it absolutely bringing their A game. There was no wink, wink, nudge, nudge from these guys. And you feel it when the look that's in George Zucco's eyes when he's passing on the instructions with the Tana leaves, and then what's going to happen when you use the 9 after you use the 3. There was no irony here, and which makes you sit up a little bit, even though then you've got this, this comical foolery with Babe and all of his hijinks, but they set a level that makes you go, you need to pay attention here.
It's kind of ironic, I think, in these films, and this one as well, is that the mummy's appearance, is scary. The notion that he, the way he walks and his slowness doesn't make him that terrifying a character. Ultimately, I think if you look at it as an adult, it's not as scary. And I think William K. Everson in Classics of the Horror Film wrote something very funny about that. He has a funny quote about how, the mummy is stiffened with age, I think, and hampered by bandages. He's slow moving, escaping from his clutches is child's play. His victims have to edge backwards and wait for him, stuff like that. But in these films, the people like George Zucco and John Carradine and Turhan Bey, they're actually kind of the scary ones, in a way. They always have to have some scary accomplice who's, guiding the mummy, because they actually bring the gravity to the film in a way in terms of a horror film. All this stuff's going on that's light. Even in the other films, the college students that are 40 years old and things are happening that are kind of, out there. But these mummies, hosts or apprentices always bring you back to the horror of the thing. I think that really is effective in the whole series, including this film. And I agree, George Zucco is always, worth watching.
I was thinking about the plot structure and how we get to know what do we call them? The assistants, right? The human bad guys in these movies, right? And I was back to the Boris Karloff, where we don't get the backstory on his character until near the end of the movie, right? And they've got the pool, and then they reuse the pool at the beginning of The Mummy's Hand. Give us, in case you forgot that movie, right? Here's the story, but we're changing the name of the main character, right? And so The Mummy's Hand is set in Egypt, right? And then all of the sequels, the next 3 are going to be set in America. But there's something, the exoticness would have been on people's minds at the time. There's a line in one of the sequels later where they go, "Why would you be afraid of Egypt? It's a modern country like any other," right? So common in so many of these movies, but the fear of the outsider and the unknown and fear of the foreigner, for better or worse, that comes into play. They've got these hats. What does that mean? There is an aspect of that that I think, maybe hasn't aged as well.
No, I absolutely. And you do make a good point that, in this case, we are the outsiders in Egypt, and we are the ones who are trying to invade and procure and steal.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's right. That's right. It's the American who comes, and then they do take the mummy in the sequels. They take the mummy to America, and then the bad guys of the movie just want their stuff back, right?
That's right. It's like, you actually took this from us, and we didn't invite you to do that.
The thing that's interesting that gets established here too with the Zucco character, then we see, and I was forgetting because of the way that Zucco shows up later, but Eduardo Cianelli, I believe was his name. The actor who plays the high priest at the top, who again was one of these fine theatrically trained actors, was doing Maxwell Anderson plays in the 30s and all kinds of great stuff. But the whole idea of this rigid acolyte who's going to protect the tomb, but then has this moment of human weakness that betrays his mission. And that repeated plot point, which I don't know whether they're thinking, this is going to be something that we're going to, this is a really good idea, but that it gets established here, that you're just waiting for the moment of seduction in which he betrays his, tract in life.
Well, and I think one of the main faults that gets attributed to these films is that there's a cheapness to them. Like, there's a quality of doing this on a budget, even though it is, it's monster movie, so they're putting it out there with, the A game. This was shot on the sets of James Whale's Green Hell. They're reusing the score from Son of Frankenstein. Jack Pierce is brought in again to do the makeup, as he did for almost all of the classic Universal monster movies. But there's just a kind of overall sense of not as much care being taken. They're even recycling some of the footage from the 1932 Mummy. Like all of the set pieces of ancient Egypt are from the 1932 movie. But there is a sense of energy and adventure that carries through, especially this film, but I think all of the other films as well. And we're going to talk more about those when we get to them. Like, they all move. These are all about an hour long. And so there's not a lot of time wasted, and you just basically go from event to event to event. But I love the fact that we do have the comic byplay between Babe and Steve. We have a pretty fun bar fight in the middle of it. We got a magician and his magician's assistant, which is his daughter, and she has a trick pistol. It shoots 10 shots. There's a lot of like fun little things that are just sprinkled throughout amidst this, horror story.
I need to talk about the trick pistol because it sure looks like it shoots real bullets into that door.
That's the trick. I was like, the trick is that there are too many bullets in this gun.
It was so bizarre to me because it really is a looped in line. When she goes to the drawer to grab her pistol, and you can tell it was added in post, where she goes, let me just grab my trick pistol, right? So that we go, okay, because we don't want her to think she's actually threatening people, because we need to like her. She's the ingenue, right?
Right.
But then later, it definitely shoots something into the door. So I'm like, wait, the trick is that it's real, right?
This was made for only $84,000. So it was a low budget film. So I think that's what they're doing. They're trying to dress it up with these kind of like fun interludes. The person we haven't mentioned yet is Cecil Kellaway, who plays our magician Solvani. And he's somebody that I remember fondly from Beast of 20,000 Fathoms. But he, like you said, Michael, he's another one who just is absolutely bringing his A game, and he's just bringing a terrific performance.
Yeah. Well, the thing about, when you mentioned, well, these are cheap, or they were cheap films or whatever, we look at it from today's standards in that sense. But really, these studios had a very specific financial structure to stay in business. It was even at MGM, you had your A unit, and then you had your B unit, which was doing, the Andy Hardy films. And by their standards, that type of, when you had to grind out 350 movies a year, there was no financial structure that could be making A movies all the time.
Right.
So this type of a thing was really about creating product and judging how much of an audience base we have for it, more than I think simply them going, oh, this isn't worthy being an A budget. I mean, Abbott and Costello made more money for that studio than anybody around, and they still never gave them an A budget on any film because it just didn't financially, it wasn't required.
You didn't need to. Exactly. It's like,
you didn't need to.
You talk about reusing footage from the last movie, I don't see that as cheap. I see that as smart.
That's economical.
It's exactly. And so
but I think that by kind of, if you think about like the Japanese monster movies, and you start to see the stock footage show up again and again, there is that sense of, I've seen this before, and there isn't that same amount of care of trying to create something new.
I think the part of it too is that the last time anybody had seen a Mummy movie was almost 10 years before. Right. It's not like where we are able to see things again and again and again at a moment's notice that we're able to recognize.
Yeah, you're not going to recall that shot of something from before.
But there is when we're I'm trying to remember, but when we're redoing the story of when we see the backstory that in the first movie was Boris Karloff when he was alive, right? Yep. There's a couple shots where he's stealing the Tana leaves, right? And then did they reshoot those couple of shots with a different actor?
Yes,
and then
but that's Karloff being wrapped up, though.
Yeah,
okay,
it's Karloff being wrapped up, and it was the scroll of Thoth in the first one, and now it's the Tana leaves. I mean, again, I just love that the whole that they just create a whole new mythos.
Yeah.
But they're able to use the same.
Yeah, I just think it's really cool because we're seeing old footage, and then they just slip in a couple shots of the new actor. But when he turns his back to get arrested, I think it's Karloff again, right? So that's good. I find that stuff really cool.
I do too. I just think that when they showed the cut-ins of Tom Tyler, compared to the footage, it's sort of like you said, the Godzilla films, like Godzilla versus Megalon, and those films they use stock footage. It's obvious it's a different film stock, and it's obvious it's not from that time. So it's kind of funny in a way, because he sort of looks like somebody whose mom just put that thing on his head, because of the way that they stick it in there so randomly. So it's kind of amusing, but hey, they did it in the original Godzilla a little better with, remember, the same kind of thing. You sometimes have to use the footage you got. And I think it was fairly resourceful, for them to do that. And I do agree that if you got to start somewhere 10 years later. Now, of course, they use that 1932 footage again later, still in other film. But, 10 years later, exactly, people don't have the access to things. So they may not have even seen that film. Who knows 10 years later. So I think it was pretty ingenious.
To mention the movie serials, I mean, especially Universal was reusing all of this stuff in the Flash Gordon serials and all of their superhero serials. All the music score from The Bride of Frankenstein was reused, as well as all of this footage. So it would have popped up in the Saturday morning stuff. Totally different mental, like, looking at it, where we would never think to do this now. They were just like, people don't remember what they saw.
Yeah, exactly. You're not going to have any kind of instant recall. Our writer, Griffin J., is responsible for kind of bringing the Mummy back to life, him and Maxwell Stone. And Griffin J. would contribute the screenplays for the next 2 Mummy movies as well, which is interesting. And we'll talk more about that as to why he makes the choices that he makes. But it is kind of fun that, we have somebody who is kind of marshaling the Mummy through this new iteration. And Christy Cabanne was an incredibly prolific director. He was not a horror director by any stretch, but it's interesting that they gave it to him. And I think, kind of going back to what you were saying, Michael, he was somebody who was efficient. He was somebody who knew how to make movies. He would later work with Monogram and PRC and Screen Guild. So he knew how to make movies cheaply and efficiently. And I think there's a lot of really fun touches that get brought to this. The animated wolf that just is like howling in the middle of this movie. As you mentioned, Frank, we've got the blacked out eyes of the Mummy, which is probably the most striking image as far as horror goes for the series.
The effect is not great. Like I know they went frame by frame and probably poked the negative. It kind of wiggles around in his eyes a little bit, but it's very effective. Yeah. And like I said, my father remembered it all those years later. And they're reusing the same shot, right? You said like every close up of the butt. And they did that with Karloff in the first movie, right? They had the one hero shot, where they had the lighting just perfect so you can enjoy the makeup. And then, 3 or 4 times in the movie, somebody looks at him and they go to that same shot. They did that in this one, right? Where the mummy's coming at, right at camera. It's effective,
So there was one thing I wanted to ask the panel, because this was something that kind of jumped out to me as I was listening to it. So the whole thing is, Kharis is trying to bring back the Princess Ananka, and he steals the Tana leaves, and they discover him. And they embalm him, and then they take him out into the desert, and they dig a hole, and they throw him in, and then they kill all the slaves so that nobody knows where the mummy is. And then they go back and move him. Why did we have to kill all the slaves? They move him to a different location so that he can guard the tomb of Ananka. This plan seems rather poorly thought out.
Maybe they should have snipped some of that stock footage right at the end, because they were just using that whole sequence of stock footage and narrating it like the original. And maybe that was like the last part of the stock footage. They probably should have just snipped it out, because it doesn't make any sense at all.
Just a little bit more.
I really like they killed the slaves thing, because even you're right, it makes no sense to kill the slaves, but it's historically accurate.
Sure.
You would build something, and then what do we do with the slaves? Do we feed them? Do we free them? Let's go ahead and kill them. So that it's just it's another type of horror, right? Real life horror in a horror film, where you go, oh my God, that's terrible that they did that. My assumption is they just killed them before moving the body, so there would be less witnesses to moving the body.
And then we kill all the priests who move the body, and then
That's right. There's one at a time, right? The idea that there's one caretaker of the knowledge at a time, and when he gets old enough, he'll share that knowledge with his.
And that is true. That is absolutely true. Like we have that one high priest of Karnak who, and then you pass it down, and then you pass it down. So there really is one person. So maybe they did kill all the priests that knew where Ananko was buried. So we move forward into 1942, The Mummy's Tomb, directed by Harold Young, again, written by Griffin J. As somebody mentioned, this takes place in America, where we catch up with Steve Banning and his buddy Babe 30 years later, which means it's 1970, folks. It's just such a weird choice because then they talk about the Russian front and things like that are so clearly in 1942. As the film series progresses, they keep doing these forward leaps in time to where we end up, nearly in the year 2000 by the end of the series. But that aside, I think The Mummy's Tomb is really fun and exciting. It's where we get introduced to Lon Chaney as the Mummy for the first time. By then, Chaney was a legit horror star, thanks to his turn in The Wolfman the year before.
The Mummy's Tomb, and if I may mention The Mummy's Ghost, I was showing these to a couple of friends of mine because I had to watch them again, and they sort of felt like they were, not as huge fans of the genre, just as out of interest. They're sort of the same movie. They're so similar in a lot of ways, and the setting's so similar. I think The Mummy's Tomb definitely has interest. I really like Turhan Bey. I think he's fantastic. I always love him in every movie. He's been in The Mad Ghoul, Captain Wild Woman, also higher quality films. The Amazing Mr. X, The Spiritualist, I think is an excellent film that he's in, and he's great in that. So I love to see him anywhere. I think he carries the film, or is like the grounding of the film. And of course, Dick Foran is back. And you guys were talking about Dick Foran, and I would like to know what you guys think, and I don't mean to be insulting or negative. To me, Dick Foran, he has a nice presence, but he's very stiff. And I always like, his smiling and his sort of sometimes when it's comical. So he's very stiff to me, and he makes me a little uncomfortable to watch. Wallace Ford is better. It doesn't seem like he aged that much. He didn't age 30 years. I like the setting. I think the setting is interesting. I think the house is a nice setting, but I think the use of the repeated use of his walking through this sort of, I don't know what that setting is of the trees or the forest over and over again. I think, it becomes a little bit grating, kind of like a Hanna-Barbera cartoon where the background's going over and over again. This is definitely Chaney's best turn as the Mummy, for sure. I think in this one. Although Mummy's Tomb, Mummy's Ghost, he does well too. But I think, he does pretty well here and at least gets some emotion through. It's not my personal favorite of the series, but it looks good. The director of photography, George Robinson, is good. It looks good and has some atmosphere, but it seems kind of repetitious to me, like a replay in a lot of ways.
Michael?
As we were talking about this particular series feeling more modern by bringing it to America specifically, I'm only thinking the other one that also happened right around the same time is Son of Dracula. And again, with Chaney bringing it to America and really kind of like getting rid of that whole European lore. Now we're starting a whole new thing going on here. And then just dumping Chaney into it, again, taking over for another actor and not really allowing him much bandwidth to do much with it is what I take away. Although, he seems as dedicated to trying to find something as he did with Son of Dracula, which is also a really interesting, if not completely successful interpretation of going, Chaney was such a big, athletic, burly guy that this if you, again, comparing it to Karloff and the sort of cadaverous, spiritual quality that he had about him, this was just simply brute force. Even Tom Tyler was a pretty thin guy. It's interesting how Tom Tyler had whatever that choices that he made physically with his hand that seemed as though it had been really distorted in some way, where Chaney just sort of it was a very different take on that, on the way he held his hand. And then suddenly it became action filled when he needed to pick up, the ingenue and carry her into the forest or whatever he did. I appreciated the fact that they continued the story in some fashion by following up with Dick Foran's character and then sort of transferring this family curse And they were, and pretty brutally killed, every one of those people. There's a lot of death, and there's a lot of violent death in this piece. So, I think that they knew where they wanted to go with it. They wanted to just have you be in peril, and he's going to get you. And it was just a matter of like, over the next 60 minutes, it's going to be how is he going to get each of these people?
Yeah, it really becomes a full-on monster movie in a way that maybe the previous films had not been.
The structure of this one reminds me a little of how a lot of the sequels of the 1980s horror movies would bring back the survivors from the last movie and to kill them off and then continue the story. And when I was thinking about that, like, okay, structurally, like, how are we going to do a sequel to The Mummy's Hand? We're going to bring them back, and it's going to be a revenge story. The monster is going to take them out one by one. And then it occurred to me, I bet that's why they made the bizarre decision to go 30 years in the future, because from a story perspective, it's actually a kindness to those characters. The characters who we enjoyed from the last movie, because this is what all these the Nightmare on Elm Streets and Friday, the Friday the 13th. It's always so sad when the final girl who you were rooting for from the last movie comes back in the sequel to get killed in the first scene. It's kind of sad.
Yeah,
right?
like she made through all that, and then dies like the next day.
Yes, and so I think, I don't know this, I'm just guessing.
This is great. I love this. Yeah,
my guess is once the decision was made that we're going to bring back these characters and the mummy's going to kill them off, somebody said, "Well, isn't that sad though?"
Yeah, they get to live 30 years of their life.
There you go. So now we see them older, and they're going to get killed off, but it's not quite as sad because they had 30 years.
Frank, that is my favorite interpretation. This whole panel is worthwhile just for that. The idea of these films being cheaper, I think bringing it to America, I agree, Michael, that makes it feel more modern. I think it also makes it feel like, okay, we don't have to build any exotic sets. We can just use, what we've got here. It's just a regular old Main Street USA. Mm-hmm. We've got those in the back. We can absolutely just trot those out. And I think that's a big part of what changes from this one, even though the 1932 one is mostly set in the US or England, I can't remember which, like it still harkens back to that ancient time much more than this one. It's where it's an ancient monster that has been transplanted into modern times.
And that house, I believe, I'm pretty sure, that house was used in the 1920s production Uncle Tom's Cabin. So they recycled that house from a 20s production. That's from, so, all the stuff in this movie is really from previous productions, although utilized well. But it's just funny how bare bones they had to go in their settings and to reuse these things over and over. But still with some innovation. I also think they did use footage from The Mummy's Hand in this film, correct?
Yes.
And the original Mummy.
Yeah. And the original Mummy, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And George Zucco is back again to kind of like pass it on to Turhan Bey. But we also have Elise Knox, who is playing the female ingenue here. And I just found out that she was Mark Harmon's mom. Kind of going back to the idea of the contemporary, the villagers, such as they are in this 1942 movie, they all get a bunch of torches to go chase down the monster. And I absolutely stopped and went and looked online. I'm like, when were flashlights invented? Because it feels like, that's what you would use in 1942. You'd go grab your flashlight, not light a torch.
No, it's 1972, isn't it?
The flashlight was invented in 1897, for those who were wondering.
If you're going to apply that logic, John Carradine or Turhan Bey or any of those guys could go just shoot all these people, and the Mummy doesn't even have to do it because they'd be much quicker about it. So we got to be careful how much logic.
Why are we using the Mummy as our assassin? I'm not sure. Michael?
Well, it also allowed them the opportunity to cut in footage from Frankenstein of those villagers, which you definitely can see the Burgermeister and a number of those other people very clearly in some of that footage.
Talking about fire, because we haven't brought up fire yet, but fire is to the Mummy what a wooden stake is to Dracula, right? So in 3 of these 4 movies, he's going to die by fire. We also haven't yet talked about how ridiculously they ignore how he comes back, right? Yep. So in every one of the first 3 movies we're talking about today, he's going to die by fire, and in the next movie, he's just walking around again. Totally fine. They didn't even bother to char him all that much. You know, he could have gotten more messed up with each movie, I think.
And where has he been hanging out?
Yeah.
Like, that's the other thing is like he's like he gets set on fire and then goes and like, you know, hides somewhere, gets new bandages perhaps, and then comes back. But yeah, I agree, Frank. Like it is one of those. It's a very much kind of a Jason or a Freddy where he is vanquished and then without explanation he's just brought back.
If they had had more money and time, it would have been a really cool scene to see to have his assistant find the charred remains, wrap it, and then start giving him some tana leaves until he regenerates. That would have been really cool, right?
I always thought exactly. I always thought for these films, and especially to make this transition, it would have been great instead of some of the stock footage or to add to it, if they would have shown the mummy's henchmen like doing that over time. Like show a little time lapse of him giving tana leaves and keeping him going until, that kind of thing. Because without the tana leaves, obviously he's not going to make it. But it's just, that would have been a nice addition as well, I think.
Well, and I think the logic also, again, the logic police needs to be kept at the door, because if you think about the tana leaves, he needs 1 a month just to keep him going. He needs 3 to keep him alive. He needs 9 to get him moving. That's a lot of tana leaves over the course of 3,000 years. He gets motivated a lot. They're dropping 9 at a time. You mentioned George Robinson, Barry, our DP here. He is somebody who has a long legacy within the genre. I'm just going to list a few of his titles, but he did the Spanish Dracula, cinematographer for that, Invisible Ray, Dracula's Daughter, Son of Frankenstein, Son of Dracula, The Cobra Woman, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, and they did a ton of the Abbott and Costello horror efforts. And one of my personal favorites, Tarantula. He's somebody who definitely gives us a really great look. I think there's a lot of atmosphere on a budget, and I give all credit to him and Harold Young and all the other folks. We haven't talked really much about Jack Pierce's design here. He's given the task of creating a monster that needs to be able to move on camera. And a lot of his stuff is still done with that painstaking putty. And there is a mask used, I think, for the longer shots, but still up close, that's some hands-on Jack Pierce work.
There's a number of low shots, and it almost looks like Chaney is wearing sneakers. His feet are very unusual in terms of like what's going on if he's dragging that, he's not doing too much damage to the bottom of his foot there.
I thought it might have been weighted. I thought he might have, as an actor, he might have wanted weighted shoes to help with his movement.
Maybe.
The design is excellent, and it has certainly of the Universal horror characters, you don't see as much, Ardith Bay or even the original Karloff mummy's countenance as you do the Chaney, mummy, and all of pop culture, and from model kits to pins to magazine covers, whatever, that's really the image that you see, and it is a frightening image. So I think Jack Pierce does a fantastic job. I think the layering of all the, which Chaney hated, all the spirit gum and the paint and the cracking stuff. Then he went out in the sun to make sure it cracked. He baked Chaney literally. I think that really has a fantastic effect. I don't feel like Chaney was maybe the best physical specimen to have as the mummy with his form necessarily. And unfortunately, even though the mummy is so frightening, he never comes off, except maybe in the Mummy's Curse a little bit, I guess, towards the end, which is a good switch. He never comes off as really powerful. Even though Jack Pierce did such a great job, and he does, look like a reanimated mummy pretty well, unlike the rubber suits and Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy and some of the other versions. It does look painstaking. It looks fantastic, but I don't know if it was really suited to a little bit of his beer belly and the way he sort of lumbers along. But I think, Jack Pierce did a yeoman-like job on I think his makeup budget for this was minuscule, but he took, and of course he never got the credit, obviously, or got paid properly, but took hours, and hours to do this. And it shows. I think it's wonderful makeup.
And it's interesting because we can see the actor's hair, first Tom Tyler and then Lon Chaney. We can see the hair is still there. And I can only imagine that was a conscious choice on Jack Pierce's part, not to do kind of a bald cap, so that we got to see something that looked human and yet still weird and uncanny. We've had several folks talk about the gait, the very specific gait of the mummy. and how I think it's his right hand that's held up close, and he's dragging his right leg while the left arm is reaching out in front. And that is something that stayed consistent throughout the series. I think in Chaney, as you said, Michael inherited it from Tom Tyler. I'm not sure who decided to come up with that, but I think it's a really interesting and distinctive trait for this mummy character.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in, and maybe I'm a mummy apologist, but I think that it's such a cool choice to give him that physical limitation, and yet still, like for me, you quoted a review that made fun of the fact that somebody could simply walk away from him, right?
Right.
But there's movie logic that, and maybe because I saw all these movies as a kid, but it's the same thing with, Jason Voorhees, walking through the woods, and he's going to catch up to these much, younger and alive girls who are trying to run away from him. And it's the inevitability that the evil is going to get you. I think that when these movies are working right, the story will suck you in, the music will suck you in, the atmosphere will suck you in. The horror is going to catch up to all of us eventually. That's what it's all about. We're all just trying to escape the thing that we will not escape. And so when, going back to the mummy's hand, but he comes into the tent, yeah, you could just probably sneak out the back of the tent. It's not going to work. The mummy's going to get you. And so having this choice of he's not quite fully back to himself yet, right? So it's like he sort of looks, he's moving like this and he's slow. And yet when his hand gets around your neck, you're dead in 10 seconds, right? So I do think that on all these movies, they're establishing the mummy as having superhuman strength. So he's very, very strong. Otherwise, because there's just not a lot of struggle. Once he gets you, you're dead. I also think that, maybe I'm an apologist, but when somebody is backed into a corner because here comes this undead thing,
sure,
I buy it. I think maybe I would just, have to just die if I saw that.
I agree, and I think it is one of those. It's monster movie logic, and there's also just going along with the monster movie logic. There's so much fainting in these movies. So many people pass out in fear, as you say, Frank, as you might indeed were you to be faced with an undead spirit coming toward you.
That's right.
I will agree with Frank, even though I said that, in that the scary thing about the mummy is he is determined. His determination. He will get you. And I think that comes out really well in the Mummy's Curse. We didn't talk about it yet because he actually starts breaking through things, which gives you a little more of a, intimidating, strength and factor. But there is something about that. I think that's what terrified me when I was younger is the mummy is going to get you, but he is going to get you, wherever you are. And that is a scary thing. Now, in the original Mummy, I think it was scarier because he could get you without being there. And he takes energy and all this, supernatural energy to get you. And that's even scarier to me. But there still is something to that you cannot get away. And that is very true. That's a good point, Frank.
We've talked about this already where the assistant falls in love, and it happens in all of these. But I feel like they kicked it up in this one where it's a little more, he's very lascivious, right? I mean, he has this crush on is it the girlfriend of the son of the Dick Foreman character?
Yep.
Right. Right. And so then this is the one where they're supposed to get married.
Yep.
Is that right? And then he says, oh, you're never going to marry that guy. I'm going to give you the 10 leaves and you're going to live forever with me. And I'm thinking to myself, not if the mummy has anything to say about it, right?
Yeah. Let's not forget whose girlfriend this is, folks. Let us move forward 2 years in real time and 3 years in screen time. So we're now in 1973 in the world of the Mummy. But this is 1944's The Mummy's Ghost, and that's directed by Reginald Borg, and again, scripted by Griffin J. And we have John Carradine joining the fold. It kind of steps things up in terms of the modern quality because it's set, like on a college campus. We have a couple of students who are Tom and Amina who are dating, and Amina is from Egypt. How exotic, how exciting. She turns out to be the reincarnation of Princess Ananka, which is again hearkening back to a plot point from the 1932 film. So nothing is wasted ever. But people's thoughts on The Mummy's Ghost, 1944.
The one thing that sticks out for me with this one is the ending with her. I mean, I don't want to jump too far ahead, what's interesting is that the mummy wins.
Yeah.
At the end.
Yeah.
You know, he gets what he's coming after and he gets away with it in his way. But this actor, Ramsey Ames, I think was her name.
Yep.
You know, she really, I mean, not since Zita Johann in the first one was the female character and ergo the actor given an opportunity to really have something to work with. I mean, what's thrust upon her that she has to deal with. And it works. This is why Zita Johann is so, you know, memorable in the early film, because they've given her the premise of how do you deal with this if you're finding out who you were and then you're finding out what your fate might be. And then as she becomes, as you see her losing her control as it goes along, it's a really, you know, a terrific acting opportunity that you don't quite see often offered in these kinds of films for her.
Agreed.
And she really knocks it out of the park. You know, I'm surprised she didn't have a bigger career, like even an Evelyn Ankers kind of person. But I think that, you know,
well, they didn't even use her for the follow-up to this one, which I thought was, again, because I find her very appealing. I think she's a great performer. Frank?
Yeah, something must have happened behind the scenes that they didn't reuse her, because these two movies were shot very close together. It's no accident that Michael jumped straight to the ending, right? Because it's so unusual for one of these movies. It's as dark of an ending as a Universal monster movie gets. I mean, it just, and it's sudden and shocking. And the bad guy wins. I mean, he takes the girl into the swamp, and it has some sort of doom and gloom ending to it. Like, you know, well, you don't always get what you want, almost like the filmmakers speaking to the audience. And if you think in terms of, you know, there's a criticism of these movies that they're recycling themselves, right? And we're seeing the same thing over and over. The filmmakers are aware of that. And so how many times can you tell the same story where we're going to, you know, burn up the monster at the end or whatever it is? Once in a while, it's almost like this is the movie that had to take the bullet for for horror in general. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Like, once in a while, if you have the ending you're not expecting,
right,
it makes the next movie you go see that much more suspenseful.
Yeah.
Which way are the filmmakers going to go now? So every once in a while, the monster has to win.
No, I agree. I think that the fact that evil wins, such as it is, or the fact that our hero or heroine is not saved, I think is so unusual and it's so distinctive. And I think it does leave the audience feeling like, whoa, it's not the same as something like a Psycho where, you know, you do it and then you're stuck with that film for the rest of the running time, where you're like, okay, this is a really dangerous movie. But it does leave you with a sense of true horror. Things don't all wrap up nicely the way we've come to expect it to.
To go to Frank's deconstruction of the earlier film, I think that it's worth really considering. This is made in 1943. This is at the not so great moment during World War II, where we don't know if we're pulling out from what's going on in Europe. We've got this foreign monster who's come in and taken our very American collegiate young woman and her boyfriend / fiance, who also happens to be the actor who originated the role of Batman, Robert Lowry. Was Batman. He was Bruce Wayne. You know, loses to this foreign entity who's come to America and taken this very, you know, all-American girl and dragged her into this historic mess of what was going on back in the old days over there, and drags her down in quicksand. I mean, I think that you look at the movies that were coming out in 43, there was room for people to like not maybe have it work out the way we as Americans hoped, and therefore we better get it together to get us out of this moment.
That's a great commentary, Michael. Barry?
I really think this film is interesting in terms of the, you know, Chaney mummy character and the fact that there's not much dimension to him, and that in the scene in which he's in the museum,
right,
and the mummy of Ananka just dissolves, you know, before his eyes, and then he's infuriated. I think that's a great scene. I think it like gives you some pathos for the mummy, you know, gives you some feeling for the mummy for that later scene. when you're actually on his side, you're identifying with him. You're like, oh, great. He actually got the best of him, and I think that really is a powerful scene. When I was a kid and watching that, I kind of saw the way he was doing that, and like the blood all over the place, the blood on his hand. I thought, wow, that looks so real. He looks like, and it was real, because he was drunk and angry most of that filming. And I think what I've read about Ramsey Ames in terms of her not being in subsequent films was that Reginald Borg was unhappy with her because she was becoming hesitant about Lon Chaney and his drinking. And in the scene at the steps at the end of the film, when they're climbing up the steps, Chaney was stumbling and unstable, and she was freaking out. And I believe the story I read, he substituted somebody else for Chaney in that scene, and she demanded that. So I think that made her persona non grata with Reginald Borg and universally reported to Universal. I think she was not going to be in any more Mummy films. But I agree. I think she was great, and her character, should have continued. But I do like some of the emotional touches that Chaney has in this film, which he does not have in the other films, and adding some dimension to the Mummy character. I still do think, though, that kind of movement. I mean. You have some great shots of him in close up, and some good lighting in that sense. But I still think that, like Christopher Lee's portrayal of the Mummy, or even like my favorite, as you know, Dr. AC. I won't bother everybody with Paul Nash's Mummy's Revenge, but these more aggressive, fast-moving mummies are a little more threatening. I think Christopher Lee's was very, very frightening. But I do like that there is at least some dimension to the Mummy in this film. He's not just stumbling around the whole time. He actually has a chance to emote a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. This is the one where I went, oh, Chaney, and I wasn't sure if it was Chaney who insisted on an opportunity to express, as an actor, because you do have that moment of Nankad's body dissolving and him reaching his hand out and clenching his fist and smashing things. Chaney wasn't necessarily a subtle actor, and so he was looking for an opportunity to really express himself physically. As you said, Michael, that was really his forte. And I think he's given that opportunity here to express himself in that way. As several people have pointed out, he wasn't super happy to be playing this character. It wasn't asking much of him as an actor, and he doesn't get to show his face. So, this was not something he was a fan of. He was already dealing with his alcoholism at this point. And so this is not a great moment for Chaney as an actor, but I think as a character, he really does bring to it what he can. We're also joined by John Carradine, who is kind of his foil. And Carradine is a wonderful presence and one of the workingest actors we've ever had. Ton of stuff in the genre, but also outside the genre, things with John Ford and things like that.
Yeah. Is there anything that John Carradine was not good in? He was always good. He just came and threw down. Again, one of the great Shakespearean actors, and worked on the stage all the time. And I think with Chaney too, the two of those guys, they tended to want to go for something deeper, for some kind of pathos. And we see in the next film an actor who basically plays that track, who isn't up to Turham Bay or George Zucco or Chaney or Carradine, and we go, right. That's what you get. We get so used to it. You get people like Edward Van Sloan or these character guys that just brought so much to these small roles. You don't sense it subtly working on you.
I think it's unfair to simply say, oh, we have a star in Lon Chaney, we have another series, we're going to force him to be wrapped up. I'd like to think that somebody behind the scenes understood the value of a great actor in a part that otherwise is just lumbering like that, right? And so I have no doubt that the actor said, "Hey, let me have this moment," or certainly if it's there in the script, I can do something with this. That's when an actor's relationship to the film that they're in is working the best. Whatever you're given, let me try something. I've got this. Let me go a little deeper. And you get a couple moments. Because that's the thing with these movies, maybe a minute or two in each movie that is truly scary, right? And these are short little movies, but most of these movies, you're just sort of filling time to get to the next appearance of the mummy. There's an awful lot of, all of these films have detective work. We found the body, and one thing we haven't talked about yet is the mold. right? In all these movies, they find a body, and then you have a doctor, you have the coroner character say, well, there's mold on the body. And going back to the mummy's tomb, when Babe shows up, and he says, "Oh no, my old friend is dead." Yeah, they found mold. Mold. Oh, I know what that means. That means the mummy's back, right?
Well, and the fact that the mold gets left, where the hand has gripped onto the throat, the fact that becomes a distinctive thing that's carried through, and I think that's a really fun piece, even if it's a little strange and illogical at times. It's something the audience can tag on to. Like you said, it's a clue that they can follow and feel like they're keeping up with the movie.
In these films, and in many mummy films, the mummy always managed to leave the calling card of a bandage. Like some of his wrapping's always there. How does that always get there? But almost every mummy movie, the wrapping's in there, which is, I don't know how it always comes off of him right at that moment, but that's kind of amusing. And as far as John Carradine goes, for all the genre actors, John Carradine has always been the most amazing to me, because he's been in something like 360 or 370 movies. This year alone, I think he made 12 movies. In this year. He was in 12 films, including stuff that we love, like the Invisible Man's Revenge, Return of the Ape Man, the Voodoo Man, which is kind of crazy. But he's in so many films, and in every film, he really gives it his all. I mean, you can tell he's really, really serious about pushing through whatever the material is. I mean, certain things he can't, and certain directors he can't as much. But like his performance in Bluebeard, Edgar G. Ulmer, such a low budget film, but he stands out, so threatening and so frightening in that film. And the same thing in this film. And like I said about the mummy situation, the mummy's almost like his henchman, in this film in a way, because his character is so powerful. To me, that's why this film stands out in the series too, among other things, is having Carradine, sort of as the center, of the horror.
Chaney apparently was a little bit more physical in this in other regards, in that apparently he nearly injured Frank Reichert, who plays the professor. When he was strangling him, apparently that actor was like, he's killing me, get him off of me. And then also when he kills the security guard later, apparently you see that guy, slam back into the plate glass of the door, and you can see him immediately like grab his head, and you're like, oh, Lon got another one.
I'm quite certain Lon Chaney was of the school of thought that pain is temporary and film is forever, right?
Or he just didn't have control of his faculties.
You started the segment talking about how they recycled a plot point from the original Mummy film. So in the original Mummy film, and we've talked about this a little bit, there's no mummy really. There's a guy, who was a mummy, but we didn't see him take off his wrappings, right? And then in that film, he's possessing the young woman who is the reincarnation of his love. And so in that film, there's these creepy things where she goes into a trance. She doesn't remember where she was, right? That's a big element of that film. When this series began, they made the choice, okay, the mummy's going to stay wrapped now, right? And so I think it was an extremely smart idea to go back to that original movie. One of the creepier, cooler things that worked in that film is putting the girl in a trance. And 2 or 3 times in this movie, right, she is wandering around in the middle of the night and collapses and doesn't remember anything. That's terrifying, right?
And wakes up with the white streak that nobody knows where that came from. Again, another really lovely, distinctive quality about this film, and only this film.
I do like the hair. It's very much like The Bride of Frankenstein, which is interesting,
So let's move forward to our last film, The Mummy's Curse, 1944. And this is set 25 years later, which puts us in 1998, 1999. It's also notable for the fact that it seems to be taking place in Louisiana, by mention of all of our Cajuns and things like that. Any theories on that one?
They didn't care.
This is the only thing I can make out of it, is that, again, Son of Dracula took place in the South. I'm not sure if they were using, leftover sets, and they just kind of thought, what's the fascination with Louisiana or something at this time? I don't know.
I won't necessarily give them the credit for this, but to me, I mean, that setting of the bayou is much more atmospheric and creepy than the setting of Massachusetts. You know what I mean? So maybe they wanted something that was a little more, quote unquote, foreign, or a little more eerie or creepy, that lent itself to more atmospherics of horror than the setting of the Massachusetts setting. But I'm not sure if they thought about that or not, but that's my theory.
Well, and my thought is, I'm like, how did Massachusetts have a bog in it somewhere? Like that to me feels like the biggest kind of cheat is the end of Mummy's Ghost, is that the fact that they throw some quicksand in, like the swamp's like, what swamp? What we're in Massachusetts here. What's going on? Maybe the end of Mummy's Ghost is them chasing Amina and Kharis all the way down to Louisiana, and then he goes into the bog. And then they, of course, he's already in Louisiana, so let's pick it up there. I do love the fact that it goes, that we do have them submerging, and that's how the mummy comes back, is that we have Amina / Ananka coming out of the mud. You know, you talk about the blacked out eyes for Tom Tyler. That is this moment for me in this film, is watching her emerge from the mud. And it's just an incredible sequence, the way they kind of undercrank the film. So she's moving a little quicker and jerkier.
Well, I think that imagery clearly was picked up with the Cushing 59 version with Christopher Lee coming out of the bog the way that he does in his own way. So while they may not have remembered a lot, they remembered that, and it was certainly, you know, impactful. This actor who is now with us, Virginia Christine, I'm someone old enough to remember when she was Mrs. Olsen on the on the television commercials with the coffee, but I kept looking at her and I'm like, how do I know this woman? And then
she was the Folgers coffee spokesperson, did like 100 commercials, and I had completely forgotten that as well. And she shows up in Billy the Kid versus Dracula with John Carradine. And I think that was the first time I realized that that's the same actor. She's quite good in this, I think, as well.
Between the iconic scene of her rising out of the mud and her Folgers commercial, she made a career out of waking up, you could say.
It's true. It's true.
I think the reason it's frustrating for a lot of fans that it moves. So I mean, I love the explanation that, oh no, at the end of the last movie, he just wandered about 2,000 miles, right? I love that. But because the reason it's frustrating for fans is because this does pick up specifically referencing the last scene of the last movie. It's not like it's not like a reboot or they ignored it. You know, I'm thinking again to compare to, you know, the movies I grew up with, you know, the 80s horror films where some sequels paid more attention to what came before it than others, right? And you just sort of had to get used to, okay, a new director came in with a new vision. They're not so concerned about what happened in the last one. More of a spiritual sequel, right? But this one's frustrating in that the last one ended, you could almost say, a cliffhanger, like what's going to happen next if he took his love and now they're in the sand. They're going to have to rise out of that sand. And so that's why the new setting is jarring. Let's talk about the musical number that starts the movie, right? Because, you know, that felt like a lot of the Universal movies to help create a time and place. We just have this jaunty little number in the pub, right?
That's always how I want my mummy movies to start, is with a Cajun novelty drinking song. You know, that's that really, you know, when I saw that when I was a kid.
Came to a mummy movie for.
Exactly. And when I saw that when I was a kid, I was like, oh, why, you know, because I saw the Abbott and Costello films. They always had to have a floor show, you know. I was like, oh no, not the mummy movies too, you know. But fortunately, it does definitely perk up from there. I think the bayou setting is really atmospheric. I think Virginia is my personal favorite of all the female stars in this series. You know, I think her performance, I think her horror acting is great. You know, her you know, jerky sort of rising from the swamp is absolutely fantastic. Her pantomime. So obviously she had some skills there, and I think she definitely brings the film up. Unfortunately, I think Peter Coe is not the most, you know, riveting presence, you know, necessarily, but I think Lon Chaney looks great in this movie. I do think, as I mentioned previously, the mummy seems a little more threatening or powerful as the film goes on. Like he actually is really strong and he's breaking stuff up and going through, you know, bars and, you know, knocking walls down, unfortunately to his own end. But I mean, you know, he is a much more, like to me, and a little bit of a more imposing character in the film. I think the film, you know, kind of peters out at the end a little bit with that conclusion, but I do think that the rising from the swamp and that whole concept, I think Dr. AC, you probably hit on it really. The probable reason is that there's so much focus on the swamp in the film, it doesn't make sense to have that in Massachusetts, you know, and the swamp is such an integral part of the film. They're going to be clearing out this swamp. You're not going to be clearing out a swamp in Massachusetts. Everybody knows that. So I really think you hit upon it probably, that they had to have somewhere where there's actually real swamps. So, and I think it really contributes greatly to the film. And I know a lot of people consider this like the petering out of the series. It's so terrible. It's so this. But to me, for whatever reason, it's like the most watchable film in terms of its sequence of events of any of them. I don't know why that is, in terms of narrative and in terms of the structure of the film and in terms of the way it builds. Maybe just because of that one scene, actually, perhaps, because that scene stands out so, and it changes the whole tone of the film. And all of a sudden, everything is really threatening. And Martin Koslick is kind of scary. And, you know, all of a sudden, everything sort of changes after that scene. So I think that scene really does catalyze the rest of the film.
And I think it's a blessing and a curse, right? That the freshness of the setting is so jarring, and yet it's what we love about it. It's like, it's not just another mummy movie. This one has a different feeling, a different flavor to it. And we do have a focus on our princess, and there's that sense of amnesia. So there's the mystery to be unraveled there. I think there's a lot of really good things about this movie. And I think the worst thing about it is the fact that that move to Louisiana goes completely unexplained. If they'd just taken any time at all to kind of throw us a bone so that we could go, okay, I will connect the dots. They don't do any of that. They just basically pick up and off we go. I think you make a great point, Frank. If they had chosen to just do a straight reboot and pick up somewhere else, but the fact that they are recalling the end of that movie that we just saw last year or earlier this year.
And all they had to do is in the explanation scene at the beginning, all they had to do was say, oh yeah, there was this thing that happened in a college in Massachusetts, and then this girl went missing. Right. Many months later, they discovered the two of them in the swamps near here, and they almost got to him. You know, just say that so that we could go, oh, that's what happened at the end of that movie. Sure.
I would have appreciated just that little bit of care.
I think just to go back a second and talk about the inexplicable musical number that is in this film. It's also worth noting that Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman had a musical number in it. And I'm wondering if that had something to do with, again, a philosophy of with all of these films being made in short order and trying to reuse sets or reuse ideas, or that they're trying to go, well, let's freshen it up.
Right.
Let's freshen up the genre with giving something for everybody. So figure out a musical number.
No, I think that's right. I think that general audience appeal is what they're going for. I mean, we had it with the bar fight in Mummy's Hand, you know, like it's there. So there's always something going on and something will appeal to some. I think it's a great idea as to, you know, why it's thrown in there. I think it's also just to say, here's where we're at. You know, here's an entire song so you can get acclimated to the idea that we're in Louisiana now.
I'm sorry to bring up Abbott and Costello once again, but the reason one of the reasons they keep coming up is they were Universal's stars of the 40s. Yep. They were the #1 box office attraction throughout all this time. So when you think of the 1940s, you think of cinema. And if you think of Universal, there's two things. There's Universal Monsters and there's Abbott and Costello. And if you look at the first half of the 40s, every Abbott and Costello movie had one or two of these musical numbers, and then into the second half of the 40s, the post World War II, they said, no, we don't need those. It's sort of a crutch, you know, like Abbott and Costello can carry these movies themselves. So I really think there was just the flavor of the time at Universal. Throw in a musical number because people like music, and it's as simple as that. Michael, you mentioned the Frankenstein versus Wolfman.
Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. Yeah, they were both.
Was that set in Europe or in America?
Yes. No, that
one's in Europe?
It's a direct sequel to The Wolfman, but then it brings in the Frankenstein story, and it's the beginning of the whole like Universal world.
Yeah, the reason I asked, this one also feels European, not just with the Bayou characters, but then you have a long abandoned monastery as a main set piece. And I don't know how many long abandoned monasteries there are in America, right? So that felt European to me, like this movie wanted to be European in the same way that bar music scene feels European.
And have Martin Koslick in there as well. You know, he's definitely bringing a European quality to it as well. Barry, I'm going to throw the ball to you kind of just to celebrate Martin Koslick, because he's somebody who, the second he comes on screen, you're like, that's a bad guy.
Martin Kozlik, I mean, in this film, it's interesting because he's not given that much to do, in this film. I mean, he is doing a lot of Yes Master and stuff like that, but he still has that screen presence, that sinister screen presence. And I think a lot of times, obviously not the most savory thing these days to consider, but, because he had that quote unquote foreign presence, he was used as Nazis, and he was used always as this intimidating presence from outside. In this film, again, he definitely adds, even though he has sort of a henchman type role, he definitely adds a lot. I mean, he, again, is one of those guys kind of like John Carradine, whether he's in The Flesh Eaters or Get Smart, or, It Takes a Thief or Hogan's Heroes, whatever, he's always good. And he's very disciplined. I mean, for the films he was in, especially some of the low budget stuff, that we love, he really is a very disciplined actor. He was also in The Frozen Ghost with Lon Chaney, and I thought his performance in that was excellent, really, really good. And I mean, again, not to put down Chaney, I love him, but he outdid Chaney definitely in terms of his, him being the heavy and him being so intense. And I think a lot of times, when he's on screen, he definitely, takes, sort of takes the center stage and takes away, from the other actors. And he was in so many things that were like, was he in Foreign Correspondent, I think? And he was in several movies with the title Nazi. I can't remember now. Nazi Agent or Nazi Spy, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, Confessions of a Nazi Spy, I think. Yeah. So he was always so stereotyped, but I just love to see him. And I think, again, he adds so much, kind of like John Carradine. He adds so much when he's in a supporting role.
Well, and he brings the villainy to this, whereas Peter Coe, as our high priest, is kind of vanilla. Ragheb, Martin Kozlik's character, who falls for the girl, and we get the same repeating pattern, like he's the one who's going to steal the girl from Kharis, and that's what brings about the downfall of the evildoers.
Well, and that scene at the end, again, to harken back to Chaney's physicality, and supposedly Chaney and he did not get along, or he did not like Chaney very much for whatever reason. But a lot of people had issues with it. Evelyn Ankers didn't like it. I mean, he was a difficult actor to work with because of his alcoholism, and he and Broderick Crawford would just get into they'd have just fist fights, these Donnybrooks that would happen on stage. But that scene where Chaney attacks the jail and tears it apart, you get a real sense of the physical power of Lon Chaney when he's rocking that door and pulls it. I mean, you can tell like he's moving fast for a change.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted more of that from the whole series. If the whole series had that in it, I think we would be looking at the series in a very different way. If it had scenes like that throughout I really do. And I think other people would too throughout the series. If he had that power, which he does have, and that could be expressed through the rest of the movies, I think the series would be looked at in a much more positive way than it is now. And I wish it was like that, because that really was it's like a release for me. When I saw that in the film lately, when I watched it again, I'm like, oh, thank goodness, finally, finally the mummy's doing something. He's destroying something. He looks powerful, and I'm just waiting for it the whole series.
Well, you talk about Christopher Lee. I mean, Christopher Lee is not hindered in that way. He's not given a limp arm that suddenly comes back to life. You can tell that Chaney likes doing physical things. Like he likes tearing things apart. He likes strangling people. He feels very comfortable in that regard. And it's unfortunate that they were not playing to his strengths, because you can tell like he actually is invested in the movie at that point. Like he's invested in these really strong physical actions. And I agree, Barry. I think that had he been given the ability to kind of create the character, because if you look at his Wolfman, right, his Larry Talbot is a very physical monster, and it's a very physical performance. And I feel like he's like, well, okay, I've been given these traits from the previous actor where I don't have the use of one arm, I don't have the use of a leg, and I got to stretch out one arm to strangle people. I mean, I could understand the frustrations of feeling like, okay, I'm inheriting somebody else's suit and it doesn't fit.
I really appreciate, like I said, Dr. AC, doing these podcasts, because there's always something I notice when I rewatch a film. And this time I noticed in all of the films, when he bends down to pick up somebody, they show it from behind him, and all of a sudden he's got both of his arms. But how does that happen? I mean, so he has to be physical. And it just, I mean, the arm up is a great gimmick, and it really is kind of creepy, thinking he's all rotted away and stuff, and he can't use his arm and he's damaged. On the other hand, it does really restrict what he could have done, and Christopher Lee did not have that, and the other mummies on screen that did not have that could really have that physicality and that threat, that imposing threat that I think Chaney seemed like he was really restricted, you know, in these films in a way.
Yeah, he becomes a very powerful zombie when he's able to use all of his faculties.
I'll just say again, you know, to again defend Slow Mummy, and then it's you know, we're now 5 movies into the series, and we have to do something more, and so he starts banging through walls, which then leads to his demise in this one, right? So this is the one where he dies in a different way, because if you live by the smashing through stuff, you're going to die by smashing through stuff, right? But to go back to, you know, my first movie ever, Night of the Living Dead, think about how zombies walk in that, right? And what Romero did, you know, he brought in these extras and said, okay, you're dead, right? And they start walking around with limps, right? They were emulating, I think, what we all remember from The Mummy. That series too, as it progressed, they had to do something more. So by the 3rd film, you know, zombies can use a gun now or something like, you know. So to me, the physical, the evolution of Lon Chaney's Mummy, and I guess, remember, he's been drinking more Tana leaves, so he's getting stronger as he goes.
Sure.
He's been drinking something, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I can't let this go. It's my favorite moment in this movie, just because it's silly and it made me giggle. When the bad guys take over the long abandoned monastery, and the guardian of the monastery shows up and says, hey, you guys can't be here. I'm the guardian of this monastery. You guys have to leave. The bad guys say, oh, we're sorry. We just need this for tonight and we'll leave tomorrow, which was very nice of them.
It was.
But then the guardian says, no, you have to leave right now. And then they're like, okay, I guess we'll kill you.
Yeah, sorry, man.
That's great.
A little leniency, folks.
Yeah, we just need it for the night, you know?
Talk about the lack of continuity. The fact that Ananka's white streak is gone completely. You know, she suddenly acquires like shoes after having been dragged off into the swamp without shoes. It's just things like that that always frustrate me as a horror fan, where I'm just like, you know, go back and watch the movie that was made 6 months ago, inform it a little bit, care just enough to make that happen, so that people who are fans will appreciate the effort that's taken.
I saw it as a magical thing, right? When that scene we keep talking about, her rising, she's dressed sort of mummy-ish, right? Like her dress is all everything. So, and then she like wanders away from there to another
to a beautician's parlor.
Yeah, she washes herself off, and then she's human again, right? And I just saw it as magic. You know, these movies aren't they're not based in reality.
Did they have blow dryers back then?
Cool. So let's wrap things up. Final thoughts on the 1940s mummies movies. Barry, let's kick things off with you.
Well, as you know, Dr. AC, I'm always one who comes on here and whines about suspending disbelief, because I think that's an important quality to have in general and in watching these films. And, you know, most films I can watch, I haven't lost that kind of childlike perspective where you can watch a film from that perspective and kind of be awed by it. And these films, I think you have to look at them that way. I think you really do have to look at them that way. You know, they're fine to look at. They're lower budget productions. They're very efficient. I think they do what they intend to do well. I really do. I mean, I think for all is said and done, all the criticisms, they do what they intend to do. And I think you have to have a little empathy for the situation that Lon Chaney was in, you know, and watch it from that perspective. But I think, like, as a body of work, I think those 4 films, while the continuity errors, you know, are really confounding and you can't really justify them to anybody, I do think they stand, you know, as a pretty important body of work in terms of the establishment of that mummy character that has lasted through the years and has been so popular and licensed, and people love the character. So I really think it is a very important part of Universal's canon, even though sometimes it's looked down upon.
Michael?
I think, just as we said at the beginning, that the exercise of being assigned to rewatch these and rewatch all 4 of them in a row was a real pleasure and a surprise. that they're as good as they are. I didn't remember them. We think of it, the mummy is nobody's favorite when you compare it to any of the other Universal monsters, but the exercise of watching them was a real pleasant surprise. And I would tell anybody, you know what? Watch them. They're fun. They're awesome.
Frank?
If you think of the most iconic monsters of all time, it goes Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, and the fourth one arguably could be the Mummy, right? So you're talking, maybe the Mummy is the Ringo of the group, but is still there. And it's so iconic. We think of the Mummy. When you look back at the original Boris Karloff, there's no mummy, right? There's that one shot of him asleep. You know, the character, one character looks and sees him. We don't get to see him. And that character loses his mind, right? He's laughing and says he woke up, right? And so that character dies in an institution, they say, because he glimpsed the living dead. And so that movie does us the kindness of not letting us see the mummy. It's that scary. It's that terrifying. The concept of a wrapped up mummy. And we all talked about going to the Field Museum and actually seeing those. Those exist. They're there. And so these movies make good on the promise of that original film. Oh, you wanted to see a mummy? You get to see a mummy. So for good or bad and everything in between, there's limited things you can do with that character. But in these four films, they did as much as they could.
And I'll reiterate what Michael said. I really had a great time going back and watching these. They are better than I remembered. And even though I nitpick, it's all meant in good fun because I love the fact that they are different and they don't necessarily pay attention. I think horror fans enjoy finding little things that they would notice that somebody else might not. And the last thing I would say is that I'm a huge Planet of the Apes fan, and I love the fact that you have to remember the sequence because it isn't Mummy 1, Mummy 2, Mummy 3, Mummy 4. Like you had to go, okay, wait, it goes hand, then tomb, then ghost. And what's the last one? Oh, curse, right. And what happens in each one of those? Like that, to me, like that's really where you can flex your classic monster fan muscles, is remembering what happened in Mummy's Ghost, what happens in Mummy's Tomb, in the same way that you have to remember, does General Aldo show up in Beneath the Planet of the Apes or in Battle for the Planet of the Apes? Thank you all so much. This has been a really delightful conversation and looking forward to having you all on again very soon. Until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.